All right, let's go ahead and get started this morning. Sorry. I have to edit that out when we post it. All right. So today we look at the second century. In some respects, we're spending quite a bit of time on these first 4 centuries compared to like the Middle Ages. We'll go through pretty quickly. But there's a lot of things that are taking place in the second century of Christianity that have profound effects on the development, even to what we see today. And so a couple of things that I want us to think about today, and really hopefully we'll have some time to discuss this towards the end, is thinking about how Christianity is beginning to change in the second century. What are the reasons for those changes, and whether these are positive changes, negative changes? Are they bringing Christians closer to what God intended, God wanted, or are they moving perhaps away? Another thing for us to be thinking about as well is that as Christians in the 21st century, especially in the United States, we face a variety of challenges. And so we can think about some of our greatest challenges being today in a variety of things, whether that's a political sphere or facing a world that doesn't hold to the morality we hold to. We can think about all the ways that media and culture can influence Christians even today. But I think it's also important for us to think, as we talked about the first class, about the past being a foreign country. And so while we face great challenges today, what were the challenges that Christians faced in the second century? What were the greatest challenges they faced? So hopefully we'll have some time toward the end of the session to talk about some of those things as well. But I think it's important for us to kind of lay a framework before we get into some of those discussions so that we have something to draw from. And as we've done and as we'll continue to do, we'll kind of break this up into categories and thinking about politics. And so what we have here as we begin the second century is Rome beginning to look at this group of people, identifying themselves as followers of Jesus, as something distinct from Jews. And because they're distinct from Jews, they aren't necessarily accorded the same types of legal protections that Jews would have been accorded because of their worship, because of their religion. But there's also a question of how, in the minds of Romans, how Christians relate to the state. And thinking about, are Christians a positive benefit for the Roman Empire, or is there a challenge here? Is there something to be concerned about when it comes to the political thinking of the Roman Empire? And a lot of that's reflected in one piece of correspondence that we have from the time, from a Roman standpoint, about Christianity. Now, perhaps other things had been written at that time. We know a couple of documents of this second century time, but really from a political standpoint, there aren't a lot of documents in the second century addressing this question of what do we do about these Christians. One of the earliest is a correspondence between a governor named Pliny, referred to as Pliny the Younger, to contrast him with Pliny the Elder, who was also a well-known individual in antiquity, and the Emperor Trajan. Pliny, as governor of Bithynia, which is in Asia Minor, or modern-day Turkey, is concerned about Christians and the effects of their presence. And so he has written to the emperor to get some advice on how to handle this. Particularly what's happened is Trajan has received a list of supposed Christians. And he's begun some investigation into some of this, but as he's gone, he's begun to encounter some things that he needs Trajan to make a decision on. Ultimately, Pliny refers to Christianity as an extravagant superstition. This is something that Pliny looks upon very negatively. It is not something positive, nor does he look at it as a viable philosophy or religion. He reports to Trajan that he's begun investigating these names. And many of the people on these names, when he inquires from them, "Are you Christian?" they have denied being Christian, or have claimed that they had been Christian, but at the time they're being investigated had quit. And so what Pliny has been doing is when he's discovered these people, and they say, "I'm not a Christian," or "I was, but I'm not anymore," he's required them to offer sacrifices to the Roman gods and to curse the name of Jesus. Two things he knows committed Christians will not do. And so if they're willing to do that, he's gone on. For those that have admitted to being Christians, he's been giving them 3 chances to deny Christ, and if they do not, he has them killed, unless they're Roman citizens, and he sends them to Rome. The Christians, he says, are too stubborn. That's a continual refrain throughout a lot of these early years of the Roman Empire and Christianity, is that Christians are too stubborn. They will not give up their superstitions. And so this has been Pliny's practice. And so he asks Trajan, "Should I continue to do this? Should I punish Christians only when they commit crimes, or is being a Christian a crime in itself?" Right? So if Christians are, is being Christian a crime? Trajan responds. And essentially Trajan's response is, don't bother seeking them out. Right? He doesn't want Pliny wasting his time or his resources investigating whether there are Christians or not. A second thing that comes from Trajan is that if you get this list that is anonymous, like the list that Pliny received, ignore it. Right? If people are not going to admit, "I'm the one that sent these names into you," then you don't need to deal with it. But if Christians are accused, if somebody is accused of being a Christian, offer them the chance to recant and punish those that refuse. This will remain the imperial policy for quite a while. He's not seeking out Christians, but if they're accused and they refuse to recant their Christianity, they are to be punished. Now here too, it's not an empire-wide persecution. Right? The Bithynia is just one place in Asia Minor. And so while this is kind of a policy that Trajan intends for the empire, it's not like there is this mass persecution of Christians. But as we've already kind of reflected, there are some Christians who lose their lives. And so you have the rise of a group of individuals that become known as martyrs. Now, to test your Greek knowledge again, does anybody know what the Greek word martyr usually translates into in the New Testament? Witness. Right, so the term itself, right, is the term itself refers to a witness. So a witness in any sort of, like in a criminal proceeding called before court. Yet it becomes used for individuals, particularly Christians in this time, who give up their lives, who are killed for their faith. Why use the term witness to describe these people? How does this term witness relate to the fact that they're dying for Christ?
Because the people that it's written about, good example.
Okay.
So in a way, they're witnesses to like us, and at that time,
Yeah, their commitment to faith is a testimony to particularly other Christians, but it also works for a testimony to outsiders, right? That they're going to stay true to Jesus even in the face of the ultimate punishment of death. The martyrs included even some rather prominent individuals and bishops, people that you would have read about in Gonzales, and some we'll talk about later, people like Ignatius, Polycarp. Polycarp has a rather interesting story that Gonzales, I believe, if I remember correctly, talks about. Polycarp had actually learned from the Apostle John, right? And so this kind of second generation of Christian. And in the early 2nd century, he's rather old. And he is hunted down because of the accusation that he's a Christian, and of course everybody knows he is. He hides out for a while, but eventually he's captured. And he is taken before the governmental officials who, because of his advanced age, want to release him. All right? Want to give him this honor, but first he has to recant. And essentially Polycarp says, and there's a document referred to as Martyrdom of Polycarp that seems to be pretty historically accurate, but his comment that, in my 84 years, he has never denied me. Why would I now deny him? And so in all that time, Jesus had remained faithful to Polycarp. Polycarp was going to remain faithful to Jesus. So serving as a witness, testimony, right, to the people that were Christians as well as non-Christians. After Trajan, several of the emperors were largely, they kind of followed his policy of, if people are accused, deal with it. But there are not a lot of emperors in that early 2nd century that are going out persecuting Christians. Eventually we get to the time of Marcus Aurelius in the middle of the 1st century. Aurelius was a Stoic, and we talked about Stoics last Thursday. Much more refined in his thinking, his approach to philosophy, but one who was more of a persecutor than some of the other emperors. He too felt that Christians were very stubborn, felt that they were bringing the wrath of the gods on the empire. And that's another aspect of this persecution that we'll see in these first several centuries, is that a lot of these emperors are concerned that the number of Christians increasing means that the old gods are being ignored in their worship. And that's having disastrous effects on Rome. During Aurelius' reign, persecution was more widespread, not only in Rome and in Asia Minor, but places even into what would become modern-day France. There is a general thinking about this time period that the Christians who faced persecution continually remained faithful and went to their death. That would be a wonderful thing to believe, but it's not true. There were Christians who, when faced with persecution, recanted their faith, lapsed their Christianity. But yes, there were those that remained firm. So we shouldn't have this kind of romantic notion of the 1st, 2nd, 3rd century of all these Christians were faithful to death. Unfortunately, they weren't. There were some. There were a lot. But there were also those that, when faced with the persecution, decided to deny Christ or offer the sacrifices. And so in the 2nd century, largely when we think of politics and persecution, There's persecution in some areas and not in others. Christianity is not, in those first 4 centuries, under this continual persecution. It shows up in spots. It's in places, largely localized. And Trajan's policy of only deal with it if it comes up is the one that most of those emperors in the 2nd century followed.